The air inside Aurelia was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere, thick with the scent of old money, leather, and the subtle, earthy perfume of black truffles. It was a place where silence was the most expensive commodity, broken only by the hushed murmur of billion-dollar deals and the delicate surgical clink of sterling silver against bone china. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, golden glow that made every face seem important, every whispered word a decree. The world outside, with its noise and its struggles, did not exist here. Within these mahogany-paneled walls, power was the currency, and discretion was the law. Clara Evans moved through this gilded sanctuary like a ghost, a silent, efficient specter in a crisp black uniform. Her movements were a study in practiced invisibility, a seamless ballet of refilling water glasses and clearing plates without ever drawing an eye, without ever disturbing the delicate ecosystem of the elite. To the patrons, she was part of the decor, a functional object no more notable than the damask napkins or the polished silverware. They never saw the mind working furiously behind her calm, composed expression, a mind that once dissected complex legal statutes with the precision of a master surgeon. Inside Clara's head, however, another world existed, a stark and sterile counterpoint to the opulence surrounding her. While her hands expertly polished a wineglass until it gleamed, her memory replayed the cold, unforgiving fluorescence of a hospital ceiling, the relentless, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, and the cloying, antiseptic smell that clung to everything. She had been the top of her class at Columbia Law, a prodigy in environmental jurisprudence, destined for a corner office and a career fighting for the voiceless. That future had evaporated the day her mother, Sarah, received the diagnosis. A rare, aggressive cancer, the doctors had said, part of a baffling cluster that had emerged in their small, forgotten hometown. The town that sat in the shadow of the new Croft Industries chemical plant. Clara had dropped out without a second thought, trading her law books for medical charts, her promising future for the sacred, heartbreaking duty of being her mother's full-time caregiver. She poured her savings, her future, and her very soul into a battle that was lost before it began, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief and suffocating debt. Now, her life was this, a series of silent, deferential gestures in a place she could never afford to eat, serving men who unknowingly represented the very system that had shattered her world. Her motivation was a quiet, burning ember she shielded from the world. It was not vengeance, not yet. It was survival, and a fierce, unwavering commitment to honor the memory of the woman who had given her everything. Every single dollar she earned in this temple of excess went toward paying down the mountain of medical debt her mother's illness had left behind. Each perfectly folded napkin, each cleared plate was a small act of defiance against the despair that threatened to consume her. She saw her mother's face in the flickering candlelight, heard her gentle encouragement in the quiet moments between orders. Her secret skill, that razor-sharp legal mind, lay dormant beneath the surface, a sleeping giant. The intricate knowledge of toxic torts, corporate negligence statutes, and the labyrinthine loopholes companies use to evade responsibility was all still there, filed away in the near photographic memory that had once made her the star of her class. She had buried that part of herself along with her mother, believing it was a tool she would never need, a painful reminder of a life that was no longer hers. She was just a waitress now, a survivor, and that was all she allowed herself to be. The arrival of Julian Croft was not an entrance, it was a conquest. The very atmosphere of Aurelia, already heavy with influence, seemed to bend and warp around him. The maître d', a man who regularly greeted senators and foreign dignitaries with unflappable poise, visibly stiffened, his professional smile becoming a mask of anxious deference. A subtle ripple of awareness spread through the dining room as Croft, flanked by two younger men in impeccably tailored suits, swept toward the most coveted private booth. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had never been told no, a man who saw the world not as a place to live, but as a board to be dominated. He shrugged off his cashmere overcoat without a backward glance, letting it fall into the waiting hands of an attendant as if shedding an insignificant burden. His eyes, the color of chipped slate, scanned the room with a look of profound boredom and ownership, dismissing everyone and everything as part of his personal landscape. He did not walk through the world. He expected the world to rearrange itself for his passage, and it always did. Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine, an inexplicable sense of dread that had nothing to do with his obvious wealth or power. It was something older, colder, a primal recognition of a predator. This is a story you will not want to miss. Before we dive into the heart of this confrontation, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you believe in stories where the overlooked find their voice and justice is finally served, make sure you are subscribed to our channel so you never miss a moment of the journey. The stage is set for a revelation that will shatter worlds, and we are about to witness the first spark that will ignite the fire. Your presence here, as part of our community, makes these stories possible, and we are thrilled to have you with us as this incredible tale of resilience and reckoning unfolds. Now, back to the silent battlefield of Aurelia, where a storm is gathering in the heart of a forgotten legal prodigy. Clara was assigned to Croft's table. As she approached, her professionalism a carefully constructed armor, the fragments of their conversation struck her like physical blows. Croft was holding court, his voice a low, confident boom that effortlessly dominated the space. He was mocking a small community's attempts to block a new acquisition, laughing about their primitive environmental concerns. He used complex chemical formulas and obscure legal precedents as weapons, wielding them not to inform but to belittle, to showcase his intellectual superiority to his fawning associates. He spoke of parts per million and statutory limitations with a dismissive wave of his hand, reducing human lives and fears to mere inconveniences on a balance sheet, trivial obstacles in the relentless pursuit of profit. Each word was a dagger twisting in Clara's memory, because the case he was so arrogantly dissecting, the corporate playbook he was describing, mirrored with chilling accuracy the exact circumstances that had poisoned her hometown, the very tragedy that had stolen her mother from her. She stood perfectly still, the heavy water pitcher in her hand feeling like a lead weight, her heart hammering a frantic, silent rhythm against her ribs. The moment of pure, unadulterated hubris arrived, as it always did with men like him. Croft, pleased with the laughter from his legal team, caught Clara's eye. He saw not a person, but an audience, a representative of the common masses he so thoroughly despised. A cruel smirk played on his lips. He gestured vaguely in her direction with his fork and said, his voice dripping with condescension, "It's all nonsense to these simple-minded people anyway. They wouldn't understand a single word of it." The insult was not just directed at her, it was an insult to her mother, to every family in her town who had suffered, to every life dismissed as collateral damage. In that instant, a fury unlike anything Clara had ever known, a rage as cold and solid as glacial ice, solidified in her veins. The image of her mother's tired, frail face in the final days, her brave smile fighting through the pain, flashed behind Clara's eyes. This man's arrogance was the sound of the machine that had crushed her. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly, became perfectly steady. Her breathing, once shallow with shock, slowed into a calm, controlled cadence. The waitress was gone, and the lawyer was beginning to wake. As he finished his pronouncement, Julian Croft leaned back, satisfied with his performance. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, a small, unconscious gesture of self-congratulation. The movement caused his shirt collar to shift, and from beneath the fabric, a piece of jewelry slipped into view, catching the dim, golden light of the chandelier. It was a locket. Not just any locket, but a unique, custom-made piece of gold shaped like a stylized hummingbird in mid-flight, its eye a tiny, brilliant sapphire. Clara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp she barely managed to suppress. The world around her dissolved. The hushed conversations, the clinking of glasses, the oppressive opulence of the room, It all faded into a roaring silence. There was only that locket. She knew every delicate curve, every intricate etching on its wings. She had traced its shape 1,000 times as a child, nestled in her mother's lap. It was the gift her mother had commissioned for a secret love, a man she had spoken of with a quiet, hopeful joy, a man Clara had never met. It was her mother's locket, an impossible, heartbreaking artifact, resting against the chest of the very man who was the architect of her suffering. The water pitcher in Clara's hand did not waver. The shock that had momentarily paralyzed her was now crystallizing into something else entirely, something hard and sharp and dangerous. It was a purpose. The disparate, painful pieces of her past suddenly slammed together with the force of a cosmic collision. The faceless corporation, the chemical leak, the man who dismissed lives with a smirk, and now, the impossible locket. They were all connected. It was him, Julian Croft. He wasn't just a symbol of the injustice that had ruined her life. He was its source. The grief that had been a constant heavy shroud for years was now being forged into a weapon. The dormant legal mind, the encyclopedic knowledge of corporate malfeasance she had thought buried forever, began to stir from its slumber, stretching and uncoiling in the depths of her consciousness. The years of pain, the helplessness, the quiet suffering, it all had a name now, and it had a face. And that face was looking at her with casual contempt, completely unaware that he had just made the single greatest mistake of his life. He had underestimated the waitress. The silence that followed Julian Croft's dismissive remark was not the comfortable, moneyed silence of Aurelia. It was a new kind of silence, sharp and brittle, stretched thin over a chasm that had just opened at his table. Clara did not move. The heavy silver water pitcher remained perfectly balanced in her hand, but inside her, a tectonic shift was occurring. The years of practiced invisibility, of self-effacing servitude, crumbled into dust. The persona of the grieving daughter, the indebted survivor, the efficient waitress. It was a shell that cracked and fell away, revealing the solid, unyielding core of the woman she had been trained to be. The legal scholar, the advocate, the top mind of her class, stirred from a long and painful slumber, awakened by the raw, unadulterated arrogance of the man before her. Her mind, once a fog of grief and exhaustion, became a landscape of crystalline clarity. Legal precedents, statutory clauses, and case law footnotes began to assemble themselves in her consciousness, not as abstract academic concepts, but as sharpened weapons, ready for deployment. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the distant laughter, and the clinking of cutlery receded until it was a meaningless hum. There was only this man, this table, and the dawning horrific certainty of his identity. Her posture changed first. It was a subtle transformation, almost imperceptible, yet it altered the very air around her. The slight, deferential slump in her shoulders, a posture learned from years of trying to take up as little space as possible, straightened. Her spine became a rod of steel, elongating her frame, lending her a sudden and unexpected authority. She lifted her chin, not in defiance, but with the calm, measured confidence of someone who knows they occupy the intellectual high ground. Her eyes, which had always been carefully trained to avoid direct contact, now locked onto Julian Croft's with an unnerving intensity. They were no longer the polite, vacant eyes of a server. They were the focused, analytical eyes of a litigator assessing a hostile witness. The fawning sycophants at his table felt the shift first, their easy laughter dying in their throats as they registered the change in the atmosphere. They looked from Clara to their boss, a flicker of confusion and unease in their expressions. They had witnessed Julian Croft eviscerate business rivals and powerful politicians without flinching, but they had never seen him silenced by the quiet, unblinking gaze of a waitress. The power dynamic at the table, so firmly established moments before, had been irrevocably broken. Julian Croft, for his part, felt it as a faint, irritating prickle of annoyance. He was accustomed to being the center of any room, the sun around which lesser planets orbited. The sudden, focused attention of his waitress was an anomaly, a breach of the natural order. He started to wave her away, to dismiss her with the same casual contempt he used for all service staff, but the words caught in his throat. There was something in her gaze that held him captive, a silent challenge that was both infuriating and, on some deep, unexamined level, unsettling. He saw not a simple-minded woman, but a formidable intelligence staring back at him, an intelligence that was calmly taking his measure and finding him wanting. The smirk on his face faltered, replaced by a slight frown of irritation. He was Julian Croft. He did not get stared down by the help. He opened his mouth to deliver a scathing put-down, to reassert his dominance, and put this impertinent woman back in her place. But before he could form the words, her voice, clear and steady as a ringing bell, cut through the silence, and the world tilted on its axis. She did not raise her voice. There was no anger in her tone, no tremor of fear or indignation. It was the voice of a lecturer correcting a student, a voice of pure, unassailable fact. "You're misquoting the Clean Water Act, Section 309C, she stated, her words precise and perfectly enunciated. The sound of the specific legal citation, spoken with such casual authority, was so jarringly out of place in the opulent dining room that it was like a gunshot. The two younger lawyers at the table physically recoiled, their eyes wide with shock. The penalties for knowing endangerment, the act of knowingly releasing a pollutant that places another person in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury, are criminal, not just civil, as you suggested. They carry a fine of up to $250,000 for an individual and a prison sentence of up to 15 years. For a corporation, the fine starts at $1 million. You were referring to the penalties for negligent violations under Section 309C1, which are significantly less severe. It's a common but critical error." The silence that followed her correction was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the private booth. The two junior associates stared at her, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. They had just been given a master class in environmental law by their waitress. Julian Croft's face, which had been a mask of arrogant amusement, had gone rigid. A dark flush crept up his neck, a telltale sign of his barely controlled fury. He had been publicly corrected, his carefully cultivated image of intellectual superiority shattered by a woman in a server's uniform. He was exposed, not just as arrogant but as incorrect. It was an intolerable, unforgivable humiliation. The legal jargon he had used as a bludgeon to impress his underlings had just been deftly turned against him, wielded with a precision he could not match. He was momentarily speechless, a state so foreign to him that it felt like a physical affliction. He searched for a response, a cutting remark to regain control, but his mind, for the first time in years, was blank. But Clara was not finished. She had disarmed him professionally. Now, she moved in for the personal strike. Her gaze dropped from his eyes to the gold locket resting against his chest, the impossible artifact that had rewritten her entire reality. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer, but it carried a weight that was 1,000 times heavier than her legal correction. It was imbued with years of grief, of loss, of a daughter's love for her mother. "That's a beautiful locket," she said, the words hanging in the air, each one a perfectly polished stone dropped into a still pond. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating. She paused, letting the statement land, letting him feel the shift from the impersonal to the deeply, terrifyingly personal. Then, she looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze holding a universe of unspoken pain and dawning horror. "My mother had one just like it. It was custom-made. There isn't another one in the world. Where did you get it?" The question was not an accusation. It was a quiet, soul-shattering inquiry that demanded an answer, a key to a lock she had never known existed. The effect on Julian Croft was profound. The anger that had been building in his chest was instantly doused by a wave of ice-cold confusion. The question about the locket was a non sequitur, a bizarre and intimate inquiry that made no sense in this context, yet it struck a chord deep within him, a place he kept walled off from his ruthless corporate life. His hand instinctively went to the locket, his fingers closing around the familiar, smooth shape of the golden hummingbird. It was his anchor, his most private and precious secret, a tangible link to a part of his life that no one, not even his closest associates, knew existed. For this woman, this waitress, to not only recognize it but to claim a connection to it was impossible. It destabilized him completely. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Was it a trick? A shakedown? But the raw, genuine grief in her eyes told him this was something else entirely. He felt a flicker of a memory, a woman's laugh, the scent of wildflowers, a life he had lost and could never reclaim. The carefully constructed walls around his heart began to tremble. But Julian Croft had not built his empire on sentimentality. His recovery was swift, his defenses slamming back into place. Confusion and a flicker of a painful memory were weaknesses, and he did not tolerate weakness in himself or others. His primary emotion resurfaced, redoubled in its intensity: rage. He was being manipulated, publicly humiliated, and now emotionally prodded by an employee. He would not stand for it. He completely ignored her question, treating it as if it had never been asked. He turned his furious gaze away from Clara and snapped his fingers with a sound like a whip crack, summoning the restaurant's manager. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and venomous, a controlled torrent of fury. "Get over here, now," he commanded. The manager, a perpetually nervous man named Philip, scurried toward the table, his face pale with anxiety. He had seen the silent tableau from across the room and knew, with the certainty of a man whose career depended on placating the powerful, that a catastrophe was unfolding. "Mr. Croft, sir, is everything all right?" Philip stammered, his eyes darting from Julian's thunderous expression to Clara's unnervingly calm demeanor. He had never had a complaint about Clara before. She was his most professional, most invisible employee. Julian didn't even look at him. He pointed a trembling finger at Clara, his knuckles white. "I will not be spoken to this way by the help," he seethed, the words dripping with a lifetime of entitled condescension. "I come to this establishment for privacy and respect, not to be lectured and interrogated by a waitress. I want her gone. Fire her, now." The command was absolute, leaving no room for discussion or appeal. It was the decree of a king ordering an execution. Philip's face went from pale to ashen. Firing an employee on the spot was one thing, but to do it at the behest of Julian Croft, a man whose patronage was worth more than Philip's annual salary, was a matter of survival. His professional loyalty and any semblance of human decency evaporated in the face of his terror. Philip turned to Clara, his expression a miserable cocktail of apology and fear. "Clara, you heard the man," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Get your things. You're dismissed." He couldn't meet her eyes. He was ashamed, but his shame was a luxury he couldn't afford. Clara, however, wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was still locked on Julian Croft. She absorbed the words, fired, dismissed, gone. But they didn't register as a defeat. In fact, they felt like a liberation. She had been freed from her gilded cage. The last chain tying her to a life of silent suffering had just been severed by the very man she now knew was her target. A strange, cold sense of calm washed over her. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She placed the silver water pitcher down on the service stand with a soft, deliberate click. She did not plead. She did not argue. She simply turned, her back straight and her head held high, and walked away from the table, leaving a crater of stunned silence in her wake. Her career at Aurelia was over. Her war against Julian Croft had just begun. The walk from the private booth to the employee locker room felt like a journey across a foreign country. Every step was deliberate, every sound magnified. She could feel the stares of the other staff members, the whispered questions, the palpable shock that rippled through the restaurant's finely tuned ecosystem. She ignored them all. In her mind, the opulent decor of Aurelia was already fading, replaced by the stark, clear lines of a legal battlefield. She changed out of her uniform, the crisp black fabric feeling like a costume she was shedding, and put on her simple street clothes. The act was symbolic, a reclaiming of her identity. She was no longer Clara the waitress. She was Clara Evans, Juris Doctor candidate and daughter of Sarah Evans. That was who she was now. That was all that mattered. The fear that should have been creeping in, the terror of unemployment, the crushing weight of her debt was absent. It had been replaced by a singular, all-consuming purpose. She finally had a name for the faceless corporate entity that had destroyed her family. And she had his face, his voice, and the impossible image of her mother's locket seared into her memory. Stepping out of the restaurant's service entrance into the cold night air of New York City was like surfacing for breath after being held underwater for years. The city lights seemed brighter, the sounds of traffic sharper, the air itself charged with a new and vital energy. For the first time since her mother's diagnosis, she felt not the heavy burden of the past, but the electrifying pull of the future. A future dedicated to one thing: justice. She walked for hours, letting the rhythm of the city match the frantic, brilliant work of her mind. Croft Industries. She repeated the name over and over. Julian Croft. She pictured his face, his arrogant smirk, his furious eyes. And the locket. That was the piece that didn't fit, the wild card in the deck. It was a symbol of a horrifying irony, a connection so twisted and cruel, it defied belief. But she couldn't focus on that now. The locket was a question for later. The corporation was the enemy she could fight. The law was the weapon she would wield. Her steps, which at first had been aimless, slowly found a direction. She was walking toward her past, toward the only place that could help her forge her future. She found herself standing in front of a weathered brownstone on the Upper West Side, the home of her former law professor, Alistair Finch. He had been more than a teacher. He had been her mentor, the one who had seen the spark of brilliance in her and had championed her career. She hadn't spoken to him since she'd dropped out, too ashamed of her perceived failure to reach out. But shame was another luxury she could no longer afford. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the stone steps and rang the bell. The sound echoed in the quiet street, a summons to an old ally for a new war. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain the past few years, the restaurant, the impossible encounter. She braced herself for pity, for disappointment, for the gentle sadness in his eyes. When the door opened, Professor Finch looked older, his hair grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, and kind. He stared at her for a long moment, his initial confusion melting into stunned recognition. "Clara," he breathed, his voice filled with a warmth she hadn't realized she'd missed so desperately. "My dear girl, what on earth? Come in, come in." He ushered her inside, into the familiar, comforting chaos of his study. Books were stacked on every available surface, the air thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. It was the scent of knowledge, of sanctuary. He sat her down in a worn leather armchair and listened, his expression shifting from concern to shock, and then to a slow-burning academic fury as she recounted the entire story. She told him everything: her mother's illness, the debt, the job at Aurelia, and the encounter with Julian Croft, culminating in the chilling details of his legal misstatement and the impossible appearance of the locket. When she finished, the room was silent for a long time. Professor Finch stared into the middle distance, his fingers steepled under his chin, his mind clearly working at a furious pace. He was not just hearing a story of personal tragedy, he was seeing the outlines of a landmark case, a textbook example of the corporate malfeasance he had spent his entire life teaching his students how to fight. He saw the arrogance, the cover-up, the human cost, and he saw in the eyes of his former star pupil not a broken victim but a warrior who had found her cause. He finally looked at her, and there was no pity in his gaze, only a profound respect and a fierce, protective anger on her behalf. "He fired you," he said, his voice a low growl. "The fool, he didn't just fire a waitress, he armed a soldier." The words sent a shiver down Clara's spine. It was a validation, a recognition of the transformation she felt within herself. She was no longer alone in this fight. "What do you need, Clara?" he asked, his tone shifting from mentor to co-conspirator. "My resources are your resources. The university's legal archives, LexisNexis, Westlaw, every database we have. My office can be your war room." It was more than she could have ever hoped for. It was the key, the arsenal she needed to begin her assault. The despair that had been a dull ache in her heart for years was finally, completely gone, burned away by the clean, bright fire of righteous purpose. "I need everything," she said, her voice steady and strong. "Everything on Croft Industries. Every permit they filed for the plant in my hometown. Every environmental impact study. Every lawsuit, every settlement, every non-disclosure agreement. I need to find the paper trail that connects Julian Croft's signature to the chemicals that killed my mother." Her legal mind, now fully awakened, was already constructing the framework of her case, identifying the pressure points, anticipating the defenses. The professor nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. He rose from his desk and walked over to a massive filing cabinet, pulling open a drawer with a loud groan of protesting metal. He began to pull out thick textbooks on toxic torts and corporate law, slamming them down on the large oak desk between them. "Then let's get to work," he declared. "The first thing we need to do is establish a clear timeline. We need to find the exact date construction began on that plant and cross-reference it with the internal memos from Croft's executive board. Men like Croft are arrogant. They believe they're untouchable. They often put their pride in writing." He opened a book to a chapter on piercing the corporate veil, the legal doctrine used to hold executives personally liable for the actions of their companies. His finger traced a line of text. "This," he said, his eyes gleaming with intellectual fervor, "is where we will find our first dagger." Clara moved to the desk, the weight of the past few years lifting from her shoulders with every step. She looked at the open book, the dense legal text that had once been her entire world. It was no longer a reminder of a life she had lost. It was a blueprint for the justice she would win. The path ahead was daunting. A monumental battle against a corporate titan with limitless resources and an army of lawyers. She would face setbacks, dead ends, and threats she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in a long time, she was not afraid. She had a mentor by her side, a brilliant legal mind reawakened within her, and a motivation as pure and powerful as a daughter's love. She was no longer running from her past, she was weaponizing it. The game was afoot, and Julian Croft had no idea that the waitress he had so carelessly discarded was now meticulously planning his complete and utter destruction. Her new life began that night, in the hallowed, dusty confines of Professor Finch's study. The city slept outside, but within those book-lined walls, a quiet, furious energy crackled in the air. Clara, fueled by black coffee and a righteous indignation that was more potent than any stimulant, pored over online legal databases, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed and confidence that had lain dormant for years. Each search query was a targeted strike, each discovered document a small victory. She felt her old self returning with a vengeance, the part of her that reveled in the intricate dance of logic and evidence, the part that could see the hidden patterns in a mountain of seemingly unrelated data. The fog of grief had been a prison, but now her clarity of purpose was a key, unlocking rooms in her mind she had thought were sealed forever. She was not just a survivor anymore, she was a hunter, and she was beginning to pick up the scent of her prey. Professor Finch worked alongside her, acting as her guide and strategist. He showed her how to access archived corporate filings from the Securities and Exchange Commission, how to search for sealed court records that might be peripherally related, and how to use the Freedom of Information Act to request documents from the Environmental Protection Agency. He explained the likely legal defenses Croft's team would mount: plausible deniability, blaming subcontractors, burying them in procedural motions, and they began to build a counter-strategy for each one. He was the seasoned general, mapping out the terrain of the battlefield, while Clara was the elite operative, ready to execute the mission with lethal precision. Their dynamic was seamless, a powerful fusion of experience and raw talent, both driven by an unshakable belief in their cause. The first glimmers of dawn were beginning to streak the sky outside, but they didn't notice. They were too engrossed in the hunt. And then they found it. It was buried deep within a preliminary environmental impact assessment filed with the state over a decade ago. It was a footnote, an appendix containing a list of chemical compounds that would be used at the new Croft Industries facility. Most of them were standard, but one, a highly toxic and unstable solvent known as trichloroethylene, was listed with an asterisk. The asterisk led to a note: to be replaced with a safer, non-carcinogenic alternative prior to operational commencement, pending further cost-benefit analysis. It was a small thing, a piece of bureaucratic jargon, but to Clara, it was a flare in the darkness. She knew that specific solvent was one of the primary carcinogens the doctors had identified in the cancer cluster that had devastated her town. The company had known. They had known it was dangerous from the very beginning. They had acknowledged the risk in writing and had promised to mitigate it. The next step was to prove that they never had. Cost-benefit analysis, Clara whispered, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. That's the key. That's the motive. They weighed the cost of the safer alternative against the cost of a potential settlement down the line, and they chose to gamble with people's lives. Professor Finch nodded grimly, his expression hardening. And a man like Croft would never delegate a decision like that. It would affect his bottom line too directly. He would have had to sign off on it himself. We need to find the internal memo where that analysis was presented and the final decision was made. The challenge was immense. Such a document would be the smoking gun, buried under layers of corporate privilege and confidentiality. But now they had a target. They were no longer searching blindly. They were hunting for a specific piece of paper, a specific signature. Clara leaned back in her chair, the first rays of morning light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A profound sense of certainty settled over her. She knew, with a conviction that resonated in her very bones, that she would find that memo. She would find Julian Croft's signature on the death warrant of her mother and so many others. She pictured his face again, not in the restaurant, but in a courtroom, on the witness stand, stripped of his power and his arrogance, forced to answer for his crimes. The image was no longer a fantasy, it was a destination. The road would be long and treacherous, but she could see the end. She looked at the mountain of books and files surrounding her, not as an obstacle, but as an arsenal. Each page was a stone, and she would build an avalanche large enough to bury an empire. The Waitress was gone. The Avenger had arrived. The initial shock of being fired had completely vanished, replaced by an electrifying sense of purpose that resonated through every fiber of her being. Walking away from Aurelia was not a retreat. It was a strategic repositioning onto a battlefield of her own choosing. The uniform she had shed was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of a life she had been forced into by circumstance, a life of quiet deference and suppressed potential. Now, free from that gilded cage, she felt the full, unbridled power of her intellect returning, a force of nature that had been held in check for far too long. The grief for her mother, once a debilitating weight that threatened to drown her, was now being forged into the sharp, unyielding edge of her resolve. Every memory of her mother's smile, every recollection of her suffering, became fuel for the fire that now burned within her. This was no longer just about paying off debts. It was about reclaiming a legacy and demanding a reckoning. The partnership with Professor Finch felt like a homecoming. In his dusty, book-lined study, surrounded by the foundational texts of justice, Clara felt more herself than she had in years. The world of legal theory and strategic litigation was her native language, and she was finally able to speak it again. Professor Finch, with his decades of experience and his unwavering moral compass, was the perfect ally. He didn't see her as a victim or a former student who had lost her way. He saw her as a colleague, a brilliant legal mind with a righteous cause. He provided not only resources but also invaluable strategic counsel, helping her channel her raw emotional drive into a methodical and disciplined plan of attack. He was the whetstone upon which she sharpened her intellect, preparing it for the monumental task of dismantling a corporate giant from the inside out. Their late-night sessions were a whirlwind of legal research, strategic brainstorming, and the slow, meticulous assembly of their case. Their initial strategy was twofold. First, they had to operate in complete secrecy. Julian Croft could not know he was being investigated, especially not by the waitress he had so contemptuously dismissed. Any hint of their activities would allow him to shred documents, intimidate potential witnesses, and use his vast legal resources to obstruct their every move. They operated under the cover of academic research, using the university's resources as a shield. Clara became a ghost, a phantom digging through digital archives and public records, careful to leave no trace that could be linked back to her. She adopted a new routine, her days spent in quiet libraries, and her nights in the professor's study, her world shrinking to the singular focus of her investigation. The city outside, with its noise and its distractions, ceased to exist for her. There was only the mission. The second part of their strategy was to build the case from the outside in. They couldn't hope to get their hands on the incriminating internal memos immediately. They needed to build a foundation of circumstantial evidence so strong that it would force discovery or compel a whistleblower to come forward. This meant starting with the public record. Clara spent weeks meticulously piecing together the history of the Croft Industries plant. She cross-referenced building permits with local zoning board meeting minutes. She read through hundreds of pages of tedious environmental impact statements, her trained eye scanning for inconsistencies, omissions, and boilerplate language designed to obscure rather than clarify. She was searching for the cracks in the corporate facade, the small, seemingly insignificant errors that, when pieced together, would reveal the larger, deliberate deception. It was painstaking, exhausting work, a search. For a rabbit in a field of paper, every day was a cycle of hope and frustration, a slow, grinding process of elimination. She learned the rhythms of the archives, the particular scent of decaying paper in the university's basement collection, the low, constant hum of the servers that held terabytes of digitized public records. Her world became a landscape of keywords, search operators, and document reference numbers. The vibrant, chaotic life of New York City became a distant, muffled sound beyond the thick library windows, a world she was no longer a part of. Her only companions were the ghosts of legal precedent and the ever-present, silent image of her mother, her face a beacon of loving encouragement in the darkest hours of the night when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her resolve. The locket remained a constant, agonizing puzzle in the back of her mind, a piece of the story that refused to fit into the neat, logical framework of a legal case. In moments of quiet, when she would rest her head against a cool pane of glass, she would allow herself to think about it. The image of the gold hummingbird, a symbol of joy and resilience her mother had adored, now felt tainted, corrupted by its proximity to the man who represented everything that was cruel and destructive. How could he possess it? The question was a torment, a splinter of profound personal mystery embedded in the heart of her professional crusade. She tried to push it aside, to categorize it as irrelevant to the task at hand, but it was impossible. The locket was a testament to a connection she couldn't comprehend, a secret life her mother had lived. It suggested a level of intimacy, of love, that seemed utterly incongruous with the soulless corporate predator she had met. This contradiction was a source of constant, low-grade pain, a reminder that the man she was hunting was not just a monster, He was a paradox, and perhaps a man her mother had once trusted. Professor Finch became her anchor in this storm of data and conflicting emotions. He was the calm, strategic center of her chaotic world, providing not just legal guidance but a steadying, emotional presence. He would arrive at the study in the early evening, bringing with him containers of hot food she had forgotten to eat and a fresh perspective on the evidence she had gathered. He would listen patiently as she detailed her frustrations, the dead ends, the feeling of being lost in an endless maze of corporate doublespeak. Then, with the calm precision of a master chess player, he would point out a new angle, suggest a different database, or reframe a legal argument in a way that suddenly illuminated a path forward. He never allowed her to wallow in despair, constantly reminding her of the strength of her cause and the power of her own intellect. He was her mentor, her strategist, and in the profound isolation of her quest, he had become her only friend, a silent partner in her righteous obsession. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic courtroom revelation, but a quiet click of a mouse in the sterile silence of a university computer lab. Clara was deep within the archives of a regional business journal, scrolling through years of press releases from Croft Industries, looking for names. She was building a map of the company's executive structure from a decade ago, hoping to identify a weak link, and there it was. A small article about a charity gala sponsored by the company, featuring a photo of the executive team. Julian Croft was at the center, of course, but standing slightly behind him was a man with a nervous smile and tired eyes, identified in the caption as David Chen, former head of environmental compliance. A quick cross-reference search revealed that Mr. Chen had left Croft Industries abruptly just 6 months after the plant in her hometown went operational. He hadn't moved to another major corporation. He had simply vanished from the corporate world, taking a position as a high school science teacher in a quiet suburb in New Jersey. It was a career change so drastic, so out of character for a man in his position, that it screamed of a story waiting to be told. Finding David Chen became her new obsession. It required a different kind of skill, not legal research, but delicate, real-world investigation. She couldn't simply call him. The name Croft would send him running. She needed to approach him on neutral ground, as a non-threatening entity. She spent 2 days learning his routine, observing from a distance. She saw a man who seemed haunted, a man who carried the weight of the world on his slumped shoulders. He was gentle with his students, but his eyes were constantly scanning his surroundings, as if he were expecting a threat to emerge from the shadows. Clara knew that look. It was the look of a man living with a secret he could no longer bear. She decided to approach him not as a lawyer, but as a concerned citizen, a potential parent in the school district. It was a risk, a performance that had to be perfect. She put on the most unassuming clothes she owned, a simple pair of jeans and a sweater, and prepared her story. Her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She intercepted him in the parking lot after school, just as a light rain began to fall. She used a carefully crafted pretext, asking about the school's science curriculum for her fictitious nephew. David Chen was polite, but distant, his answers short, his eyes eager to leave. He was a man who had perfected the art of not engaging. Clara knew she had only one chance to break through his defenses. As he turned to get into his car, she said, her voice quiet but clear, "My nephew lives in a town called Linwood. Maybe you've heard of it? It's where Croft Industries built that new chemical plant about 10 years ago." The reaction was instantaneous and profound. David Chen froze, his hand hovering over the car door handle. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale gray. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a raw, unmistakable terror. He knew. In that single silent moment, she knew that he knew everything. The years of corporate silence were broken by a single name, a single town, spoken in the rain-slicked parking lot of a suburban high school. He didn't speak. He simply gestured with a trembling hand toward a small, nondescript coffee shop across the street. The walk there was silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Inside, they took a small booth in the corner, the generic cheerfulness of the cafe, a stark contrast to the grim reality that hung between them. David Chen stared into his cup of black coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. His hands shaking so violently he had to clasp them together on the table. Clara waited, giving him the space he needed. She knew that pushing him now would only make him retreat further into his shell of fear. She had to let him be the one to break the silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up at her, his eyes swimming with a decade of guilt and regret. "They told us it was a 1 in a million chance," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disuse, as if he were speaking words he had kept locked away for years. "A statistical anomaly, but it wasn't. We knew from the beginning." The story poured out of him in a torrent, a confession that had been dammed up for a decade. He spoke of the internal reports, the risk assessments that clearly stated the trichloroethylene solvent was unstable and had a high probability of leaching into the local groundwater without a costly, state-of-the-art containment system. He described the meetings where he had raised these concerns, only to be shut down by Croft's legal team, who argued that the cost of the system was prohibitive, and that the company's liability could be managed through legal loopholes and sealed settlements if the worst should happen. He painted a vivid picture of the corporate culture at Croft Industries, a place where profits were valued above all else, and where dissent was met with threats and intimidation. He was the man who was supposed to ensure their compliance, but he had been systematically overruled and marginalized, his warnings ignored at every turn. He told her about the final meeting, the one where the decision was made. It had been in Julian Croft's office, a cavernous space on the top floor of Croft Tower, with a view that made the city look like a toy. David had made one last, desperate plea, presenting a file with the starkest data, the most dire predictions. Julian Croft had listened with an expression of profound boredom, then had taken the file and dropped it into his shredder without reading a single page. "We are in the business of progress, Mr. Chen, not paralysis," Croft had said, his voice as cold as the glass and steel surrounding them. "Your job is to manage the paperwork, not to question my decisions." It was after that meeting that David knew he had to leave. He was offered a generous severance package, tied to an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that legally bound him to silence for the rest of his life. He had taken the money, burdened by guilt but terrified for his family's safety. Clara listened to his story, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Every word he spoke was a confirmation of her worst fears, a brick in the wall of evidence she was building. But she needed more than his story. She needed proof. "The memo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The cost-benefit analysis you mentioned, does it still exist?" David shook his head, a look of despair on his face. "It would have been on the internal servers, but something that sensitive would have been scrubbed years ago. There's no way to get it now." It was a dead end, a crushing blow. His testimony was powerful, but without the document to back it up, it was just one man's word against a corporate behemoth. A wave of defeat washed over Clara, the first she had felt in weeks. She had come so close, only to be stopped by a digital wall she could not breach. But then a flicker of memory sparked in David's eyes. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "There was one other person in that final meeting," he said. "Croft's executive assistant, a woman named Eleanor Vance. She was meticulous. She kept her own digital and physical copies of everything that crossed her desk. She called it her insurance policy. She was let go a few years after I was, under a cloud of suspicion. I heard she moved somewhere upstate. The name, Eleanor Vance, was a lifeline. An insurance policy. It was the key." Clara felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of hope that was almost painful in its intensity. The hunt was not over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. She now had a name and a target, the keeper of Julian Croft's secrets. The next phase of the investigation required a different kind of infiltration, one that was less about legal databases and more about human intelligence. Finding Eleanor Vance was not as simple as looking her up in a phone book. A woman who kept an insurance policy against a man like Julian Croft would not be easy to find. Clara and Professor Finch pooled their resources, using alumni networks and private investigator databases to search for her. It took weeks of painstaking work, following false leads and digital breadcrumbs that led to nowhere. The trail was cold, and Clara began to fear that this, too, was a dead end. The pressure was mounting. She could feel an invisible clock ticking, a sense that the window of opportunity was closing. She imagined Julian Croft moving through his world of power and privilege, completely oblivious to the storm gathering on his horizon, and the injustice of it all fueled her determination. Finally, they found her. She was living in a small, remote town in the Catskills, running a quiet antique shop. She had changed her name, but a property record search using her date of birth confirmed her identity. Clara knew this would be the most difficult confrontation yet. Eleanor Vance was not a guilt-ridden man like David Chen. She was a professional who had likely been burned by the corporate world and would be deeply suspicious of any stranger asking questions about her past. Clara would have only one chance to earn her trust. She drove upstate alone, the winding mountain roads a reflection of the twisting, uncertain path she was on. The antique shop was a charming, cluttered place, filled with the ghosts of other people's lives. Eleanor was an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She watched Clara browse the shop with a polite but guarded expression. Clara didn't try to use a pretext this time. She walked directly up to the counter, her heart pounding, and laid a single photograph on the polished wood surface. It was a picture of her mother, smiling, taken just a few months before her diagnosis. Her name was Sarah Evans, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She died of cancer 3 years ago. She lived in Linwood, near the Croft Industries plant. I believe you know why. Eleanor's professional composure cracked. She stared at the photograph, then at Clara's face, and a flicker of recognition, of pity, and of something that looked like fear crossed her features. She looked around the empty shop, then silently flipped the sign on the door from open to closed. She led Clara into a small back office, a room that smelled of old wood and lemon polish, and closed the door behind them. The conversation that followed was not a confession, but a negotiation. Eleanor was cautious, her words chosen with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating treacherous corporate waters. She did not admit to anything at first, instead probing Clara with questions, testing her knowledge, her motives, her resolve. She had been betrayed before and had no intention of being a pawn in someone else's game. But as Clara laid out the facts of her case, the evidence she had gathered, the testimony from David Chen, and the deep, personal nature of her quest, she could see the walls of Eleanor's resistance beginning to crumble. Eleanor saw in Clara not an opportunist, but a daughter seeking justice, a reflection of the same moral outrage she herself had suppressed for years. She had watched Julian Croft make decisions that she knew were morally bankrupt, and the weight of her complicity had been a silent burden for a long time. Finally, after a long, tense silence, Eleanor made her decision. She walked over to a large, antique roll-top desk and unlocked a hidden compartment with a small, ornate key. From within, she pulled out a slim, black, external hard drive. "I knew this day would come," she said, her voice a mixture of resignation and relief. "I couldn't live with myself if I destroyed it. But I was too afraid to ever use it." She placed the hard drive on the desk between them. It was the insurance policy. It contained scanned copies of every sensitive document that had passed through her office for 5 years, including internal audits, redacted safety reports, and a folder simply labeled Linwood Project. Clara felt a tremor run through her body. Everything she had been fighting for, everything she had sacrificed, was contained in that small black rectangle. Back in Professor Finch's study, the air was thick with anticipation. They plugged the hard drive into the computer, their hands trembling slightly. They opened the Linwood Project folder, and there it was. A PDF file of a multi-page memorandum, addressed directly to Julian Croft from his chief financial officer. The subject line read, "Final Cost-Benefit Analysis, Linwood Project Environmental Containment." Page by page, it laid out the cold, brutal calculus. The cost of the safer, non-carcinogenic solvent, and the required containment system, was estimated at $50 million. The projected cost of potential litigation, settlements, and regulatory fines, discounted over 20 years, was estimated at less than $30 million. The final recommendation was clear: proceed with the cheaper, more dangerous chemical and manage the fallout as a future liability. And there, on the final page, was the authorization, a single line, typed and dated, approved. JC. It was the smoking gun. It was the signature on her mother's death warrant. Clara stared at the screen, the letters blurring through a sudden film of tears. It was a moment of profound, gut-wrenching victory. The cold, abstract case she had been building for months now had a heart, a black, incriminating heart, with Julian Croft's initials written on it. The validation was overwhelming, but so was the grief. Seeing the decision laid out in such cold economic terms, seeing the value of her mother's life reduced to a number on a balance sheet, was a unique and terrible kind of pain. Professor Finch placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes filled with a grim, righteous fury. "You have him, Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have him dead to rights. Now we must decide on the venue for the execution." The final piece of the puzzle was the strategy for the reveal. A lawsuit would take years, getting bogged down in procedural motions and appeals. Croft would use his army of lawyers to delay and obstruct, bleeding Clara dry long before the case ever saw the inside of a courtroom. They needed something more immediate, more public, more devastating. They needed to strip him of his power and his reputation in a single, undeniable blow. It was Professor Finch who came up with the idea. The Croft Industries annual shareholder meeting was in 2 weeks. It was the one time of year when Julian Croft was at his most visible and his most vulnerable, performing for the investors and the global financial press. It was a stage, and they would use it to stage his downfall. Clara felt a cold, clear sense of purpose settle over her. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and perfect. She would not be a plaintiff in a courtroom. She would be an accuser in the court of public opinion. She began her preparations immediately, securing a press pass through a connection of Finch's at a small, independent financial news outlet. She prepared a presentation, a concise, damning summary of the evidence contained on Eleanor's hard drive. She included the memo, the internal reports, and David Chen's anonymized testimony. And she chose the final slide with care. It was not a legal document or a financial chart. It was the same photograph of her mother she had shown to Eleanor Vance, her smile radiant, her eyes full of life. This would not be an abstract discussion of corporate negligence. She would give the crime a face. She would give her mother her name back. As the day of the meeting approached, Clara felt a strange sense of calm. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for years were gone, replaced by an unshakable resolve. She thought about the locket one last time. The mystery of it still lingered, a painful, unanswered question. How could the man who signed that memo have any connection to the woman in the photograph? But she realized that, for now, it didn't matter. The man in the memo was the one she had to defeat. The man connected to the locket was a ghost she would have to confront later. Her focus was singular. She was no longer Clara the waitress or Clara the grieving daughter. She was an instrument of justice, honed and sharpened by grief, and she was about to be pointed directly at the heart of an empire. The stage was set, the evidence was secure, and the final act was about to begin. Julian Croft had no idea that his meticulously constructed world was about to be brought crashing down by the simple-minded woman he had so carelessly dismissed. The auditorium for the Croft Industries annual shareholder meeting was a cathedral built to the god of capital. It was a cavernous space of brushed steel, dark wood, and tiered seating upholstered in a shade of blue so deep it seemed to absorb all light and sound. The air itself felt different here, filtered and chilled to a precise temperature, carrying the faint, sterile scent of new electronics and industrial carpeting. On the stage, under the unforgiving glare of a dozen spotlights that turned him into a near-mythical figure, Julian Croft commanded his kingdom. He stood behind a sleek, minimalist lectern, a massive screen behind him displaying upward trending graphs and projections of ever-increasing profit. He was the picture of control, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that rolled through the state-of-the-art sound system, assuring his investors of a future as bright and polished as the stage on which he stood. In this room he was not a man. He was an institution, an infallible oracle of the market, and his word was gospel. Clara sat in the press section, a small island of journalists in a sea of expensive suits. She was an anomaly, her simple, dark blazer and focused intensity, a stark contrast to the casual entitlement that surrounded her. She felt no fear, no anxiety. The frantic, desperate energy of the past few weeks had coalesced into a dense, heavy calm at the center of her being. She was not here to ask a question. She was here to deliver a verdict. The question and answer session began, and a line of fawning analysts and major investors formed behind the floor microphones. They asked softball questions about dividend yields and emerging markets, each one an opportunity for Julian to further burnish his legend with well-rehearsed answers about synergy and shareholder value. Clara waited, her patience absolute. She watched him, studying the way he used his hands to emphasize a point, the easy, charming smile he deployed to deflect a slightly more challenging inquiry. He was a master performer, completely at ease in the spotlight, utterly unaware of the abyss that was about to open up beneath his feet. She clutched the small, unassuming flash drive in her pocket, the cold plastic, a tangible link to the truth she was about to unleash. Inside her mind, she saw her mother's face, not as the frail patient in a hospital bed, but as the vibrant, laughing woman who had taught her to read, to question, to fight for what was right. Her mother's memory was not a source of pain now, but a wellspring of strength, a silent, loving presence, giving her the courage to see this through to the end. Finally, the moderator gestured in her direction, his voice a distant buzz in her ears. It was her turn. The moment had arrived. She walked to the microphone, her steps measured and deliberate. The sound of her sensible shoes on the plush carpeting was swallowed by the immense silence of the hall. All eyes were on her, a flicker of curiosity rippling through the audience. She did not look like one of them. She reached the microphone and adjusted it, her hand perfectly steady. She looked directly at the stage, not at the blinding lights, but at the man standing in their glare. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice clear and amplified, carrying to every corner of the vast auditorium without a single tremor. "My name is Clara Evans. I'm here on behalf of the families of Linwood." The name hung in the air for a moment, a foreign word in this temple of global finance. A flicker of something. Annoyance? Confusion? Crossed Julian's face. He clearly did not recognize the name of the small town his company had poisoned. "I have a question about the Linwood project, specifically regarding the cost-benefit analysis that recommended the use of trichloroethylene, despite internal reports warning of its high carcinogenic properties and the extreme likelihood of groundwater contamination." The professional, legalistic language was a deliberate choice, a surgical strike designed to pierce his corporate armor. A murmur went through the crowd. The journalists in her section began typing furiously. The mood in the room had shifted from placid self-congratulation to sharp, sudden tension. Julian's smile tightened, the charm evaporating to reveal the cold, hard predator beneath. It was a challenge, a public one, and his instinct was to crush it. "I believe you're mistaken," he said, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Croft Industries has always adhered to the highest standards of environmental safety. All of our facilities meet or exceed all federal and state regulations. I think you'll find the public record reflects that." He was preparing to dismiss her, to move on to the next question, to bury her accusation under the weight of his corporate denial. But Clara was ready. "The public record does not contain the internal memorandum, dated October 17, 2012, which I have right here," she said, holding up the small flash drive. The one in which your CFO calculated that the $50 million cost of a proper containment system was less favorable than the projected $30 million cost of managing the inevitable litigation and settlements from what your own team referred to as statistically probable loss of life, an analysis which you personally approved with your initials. Then, before he could respond, she played her final card. But I understand. It's easy to talk about externalities and acceptable losses when you don't have to look the victims in the face. With a click of a small remote in her hand, the screen behind Julian Croft, the one that had been displaying his company's triumphant financial data, went black for a second, then lit up with a single radiant image. It was the photograph of her mother, Sarah Evans, her smile full of a life that had been stolen. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. For Julian Croft, the world did not just stop. It fractured into a million unrecognizable pieces. The faces of the shareholders, the glare of the lights, the hushed shock of the auditorium, it all dissolved into a meaningless blur. There was only the face on the screen. A face he knew better than his own. A face he saw every night in his dreams. A face that had been the secret, cherished center of his guarded heart for more than a decade. It was Sarah. His Sarah. The woman he had loved with a depth and sincerity that no one in his corporate life could ever imagine. The woman he had secretly married in a small, private ceremony. The woman who had vanished from his life without a trace, leaving him with nothing but a gold locket and a wound that had never healed. He had spent years and a small fortune trying to find her, his best investigators hitting nothing but dead ends. He had imagined 1,000 scenarios, but never this. Never this. The name this woman had spoken, Clara Evans, suddenly connected in his mind. Sarah's daughter, the stepdaughter he had never met. The child she had spoken of with such fierce, protective love. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow, forming a picture of such grotesque, unbearable horror that it stole the very breath from his lungs. His company, his decision, his signature, the abstract cost-benefit analysis, the faceless town, the statistical probabilities, it was all a lie. It had never been about numbers on a spreadsheet, it had been about her. He had, in his blind, arrogant pursuit of profit, signed the death warrant of the only person he had ever truly loved. The locket around his neck, the one he touched every single day as a reminder of his lost love, suddenly felt like it was burning into his skin, a brand of his own monstrous sin. A sound escaped his lips, a raw, guttural cry of pure, undiluted agony that had nothing to do with a falling stock price or a public relations disaster. It was the sound of a man's soul being ripped in two. He stumbled backward, away from the lectern, his hand outstretched toward the image on the screen, as if he could somehow reach through time and space to touch her, to warn her, to save her. His legs gave out from under him, and he collapsed to the stage, the carefully constructed facade of the corporate titan shattering completely, revealing the broken, weeping man underneath. In front of the entire world, Julian Croft, the master of the universe, was reduced to nothing, brought down not by a market crash or a corporate raider, but by the devastating, inescapable power of the truth, delivered by the daughter of the woman he had unknowingly destroyed. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Clara finally exposed the truth and brought a titan to his knees. The auditorium erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed like a violent lightning storm, capturing every angle of the fallen billionaire's public disintegration. Journalists shouted questions, their voices a cacophony of disbelief and excitement. Board members scrambled onto the stage, their faces masks of panic and confusion, trying to shield their disgraced CEO from the ravenous eyes of the world's media. The stock ticker, displayed on news channels broadcasting the event live, began to plummet in a sheer, vertical drop, erasing billions of dollars of value in a matter of seconds. Clara stood at the microphone for a moment longer, a solitary, still point in the swirling vortex of chaos. She felt no triumph, no joy in his destruction. There was only a profound, somber sense of an ending, of a great and terrible weight finally being lifted. Justice had been served, not in a sterile courtroom, but here, in the heart of his empire, in a way that was as personal as it was public. She turned and walked away from the microphone, melting back into the crowd, her work finally, irrevocably done. The story of Julian Croft's downfall would lead every newscast for weeks, a modern corporate tragedy of hubris and ruin. But for Clara, the story was over. It was time for a new one to begin. Months later, Clara stood in an office that was the complete antithesis of Julian Croft's corporate throne room. It was on the top floor of a building, but the view was not of a city to be dominated, but of a sprawling park, a vibrant expanse of green that reminded her of the world she was now dedicated to protecting. The office was filled with light, the walls lined with books, not financial reports, and on her desk, next to a stack of legal briefs, sat the framed photograph of her mother. She had been approached by one of the country's most prestigious environmental law firms, who had watched her takedown of Croft Industries with a mixture of awe and admiration. They hadn't just offered her a job, they had offered her a mission. They created a new, fully funded division for her to lead, a rapid response unit dedicated to representing communities in cases of corporate negligence. She had accepted without hesitation the massive class action settlement against the now bankrupt Croft Industries had provided justice for the families of Linwood, and a portion of the legal fees had endowed her new division, ensuring she would have the resources to fight for others for years to come. Her life was no longer defined by grief and debt, but by purpose and action. She was no longer running from her past, she was honoring it in the most powerful way imaginable. Every case she took on, every corporation she held accountable, was a tribute to the memory of Sarah Evans. She had learned the full, heartbreaking story of her mother and Julian Croft, a tale of two people from different worlds who had found a brief, secret happiness before his ambition had unknowingly destroyed it. It was a tragedy that had nearly consumed her, but she had refused to be its final victim. Instead, she had transformed her pain into a shield, her intellect into a sword, and her personal quest for justice into a public crusade. She had found her voice in the silence of her grief, reclaimed her power from the ashes of her shattered dreams, and built a new life, a new legacy, not of vengeance, but of protection. She was finally the woman her mother had always known she could be, a warrior for the voiceless, ensuring that no other daughter would have to suffer the way she had. Her journey had come full circle, ending not in darkness, but in the bright, clear light of a hard-won peace. If Clara's incredible journey from an overlooked waitress to a powerhouse for justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see that one voice can change the world. And for more unforgettable stories of resilience and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single moment of righteous victory. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to light, reminding us all that courage and truth are the most formidable forces on earth. Thank you for being a part of this community and for believing in the power of a story to make a difference. We look forward to seeing you again as we uncover the next tale of an underdog who rises to reclaim their power and reshape their destiny. Until then, remember that within every person lies the potential for extraordinary change, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed upon the world.